Hello, and welcome to the presentation on an update on the experimental evidence for parapsychological phenomena. Now, if all goes according to plan, you are now seeing the PowerPoint presentation. I am Etzel Cardeña. I am the Thorsen Professor in Psychology at Lund University, one of the foremost universities in Scandinavia. So this is the outline of the presentation for today. First, and very importantly, I will define what I mean by parapsychology, or Psi, to give an abbreviation. Then I will mention some very common fallacies and a couple of facts that may surprise some of you. And then I will talk about the two main research approaches to the topic and concentrate mostly on what did my umbrella meta-analysis, or a compilation of meta-analysis, reveal about Psi research, with a follow-up to the 2018 paper in which I describe those meta-analyses. So first, let's go into what is parapsychology. One thing is that there are many things that are called parapsychology that are not. Parapsychology does not have to do with astrology or magic or reading tarot cards or anything of the sort. So what those of us who do research on this area mean by parapsychology is the scientific study of both what is and is not Psi. Before I mention or describe what I mean by Psi, let me just describe what I mean by underlying the scientific. And by that, I mean that those of us who do research on this topic follow the research method. And I can tell you, because I do research in other areas in psychology, that the main difference when I do research in parapsychology or Psi, and when I do research on dissociation or hypnosis, is that the controls for a Psi experiment are far more stringent. And in a sense, one needs to be paranoid and think about all potential explanation before trying to do any kind of work. So, but what do we mean about Psi, about this scientific study? There are three main areas that follow under the umbrella of Psi. First one, what used to be called ESP, or extrasensory perception. And this is put in quotation marks because most of us who work in this area do not believe that whatever the mechanism is has to do with perception. But that is sort of the common term. Some of us use now the term anomalous cognition to mean that there is some kind of cognition that is not explained through the ordinary senses. So what ESP means is that there seems to be a correspondence between cognition or physiology and events that are spatially or temporally distant, and that correspondence cannot be explained by the senses, the reason, or chance. And I will give you an example in the next slide. And this is mostly what I will concentrate on today's presentation. In addition to ESP, Psi also does research on PK, or psychokinesis, which is the apparent transfer of energy not mediated by mechanical means, such as when a person has the intention of affecting the random output of a random number generator, and somehow, after the person has this intention, the output becomes non-random. And finally, there is an area that is not quite as developed as the other two, at least recently, and that is to look at evidence suggestive of survival. For example, cases in which children may start talking about when they had previous lives, and sometimes even give accurate information about that previous lives. One thing that you should know is that parapsychology is studied throughout the world, that there are faculty in very good universities such as Cambridge, UC Irvine, Edinburgh, Ludwig Maximilians in München, which is one of the most important universities in Germany, and Lund, who are doing work on this area. And let's go now to the fallacies and the two facts. So the fallacies and or the statements are on the left, and then the responses on the right. First fallacy: all good scientists are against Psi. It's completely false. All surveys that have been carried out so far have shown that the majority of scientists support studying this phenomena. They may or may not be convinced by the evidence, but the majority support it. And there are actually a number of very eminent physicists and psychologists who have done research on Psi. More of that later. Next point: parapsychology is a pseudoscience, which is typically used more as a label than as an argument. But this is false as well because parapsychology follows the scientific method. So whatever the results are, whatever the implications are, they depend on following the scientific method and argumentation. Number 3, studies in Psi are not published in quote unquote real journals. It's completely false, or not in peer-reviewed journals. In psychology, for example, there have been a number of studies published in Psychological Bulletin, one of the most important journals, American Psychologist, and some years ago, they were published in Nature and Science, and there are also studies published in some important mainstream physics journals. So even though it is really difficult to get an experiment or a theoretical piece in mainstream journals, it does happen and continues to happen. Next point. Parapsychological phenomena can be explained away by the file drawer effect, by which critics mean that the only results that are published are results that are supportive of psi, and the ones that do not support psi phenomena are not published. This is false. Actually, in parapsychology, we started publishing null results going against the psi hypothesis decades before the quote-unquote crisis that we now have in psychology and in other sciences. So you will find that in the parapsychology journals, there are a plethora of articles supporting psi and also a plethora of articles not showing good replications, positive replications. So it is not a good explanation to believe that only positive studies are published by parapsychology journals. Next point. Some people say, well, psi invalidates mainstream physics somehow, and there is a very famous scientist who wrote that if psi were real, then all of physics would come tumbling down. That is absolutely false. There are a number of physicists who have written that's not the case. What we know to be the case, and what psi may do is to supplement our understanding of how the universe works, but not to somehow falsify what we have found is already the case. Next point, the results do not replicate in parapsychology. And it is a notion that one has a supportive study, but then other people follow it and they are not able to replicate. As I will show in this presentation, that is false. Meta-analysis, which I will define in a moment, show that results do replicate in parapsychology, but next point, they do not always replicate. So you have some studies that find supportive evidence, some that do not. That is a fact, that is true, but that is the case in other areas, in many areas in psychology, medicine, and even physics. So it is not the case as the fact that the psi cannot be proved or shown on demand shows that this is somehow different than what happens in other areas. And the final fact is that we understand very little about psi. Assuming that that is the case, that it is a real hypothesis. And I would say that is fact, but it is very understandable because there have been very few resources allocated to it. There have been studies showing that the decades-long financial support for parapsychological research was equivalent to the financial support for 2 months of ordinary psychology. So it's not that unusual that we have a long way to go. So some fallacies and 2 facts. So now let me take one classical example and I'll talk about what is good about it and what is not good about it. Louisa Rhine, the spouse of Joseph Banks Rhine, the 2 of them very important famous parapsychologists, compiled a number of spontaneous events, such as this. Friday, October 31, in the night, I became suddenly worried over my sister. She lived in the same town. Sleep was impossible. I walked the floor until 3 a.m. The next day, November 1, almost sick with worry, I tried to telephone my sister. Twice I picked up the receiver and each time hung it back without calling her. An hour went by and then the telephone rang. My sister had been instantly killed in her car. A gravel truck struck her 3 blocks from her home. Now, that sounds very dramatic, and that is a kind of case that is covered under the descriptive approach to psi. So the descriptive approach uses naturally occurring events to try to look at patterns in what occurs in everyday life. Now, it has weaknesses and strengths. Weaknesses, it is typically retrospective, and it has multiple potential explanations. So we may say, well, that sounds like a very unusual correspondence, but we do not know if, for example, there was sensory leakage, that maybe that crash was very, very loud, and even though the sister had not realized it, she had somehow heard it. Or maybe she has embellished her account, and in some cases, there is even fraud. So in a descriptive approach, you cannot rule out these potential explanations. On the other hand, the strength is that it shows how things happen in everyday life. It can allow for the interaction of complex variables, such as death. And we know that one of the most important aspects of the descriptive approach to psi has been to show that what are called crisis events means that when people have been in a crisis, in a big accident, or have died, that is when it is more likely that somebody close to them that is not geographically by may have then a sensation, a sense, an intuition that something happened to the person who was injured or dead. So as a supplement to this, we have the experimental approach, which is what I will be concentrating on in this presentation. As an experiment, you manipulate variables in a controlled setting. The strengths is that you can control a number of confounding variables. You can test alternative hypotheses. You can look at concurrent observations, take measures, do statistical analysis. It also has weaknesses. Some variables cannot be reproduced. We cannot kill people close by to the participant to see whether the participant somehow senses it. We cannot produce very strong emotional events in the lab. So the way that I and a number of other scientists, including people in physics and cosmology, conclude that both approaches are complementary and necessary. So let's get even closer into the meta-analysis or my survey of meta-analysis. So what is a meta-analysis? An MA, or meta-analysis, is a cumulative statistical analysis of studies on a particular area. Point two, if you follow my cursor, it is widely used in all areas of science, because in most areas of science, or in all areas of science, there are phenomena that cannot be replicated every single time. And finally, something that people may not know is that the first comprehensive meta-analysis was actually conducted on psi research and supported it. So to give you an example, this was just a random meta-analysis I found. These researchers looked at the relation between practicing mindfulness and whether it affected cortisol, a hormone that is related to stress. So each one of these lines represents a study. 0 means that there was no effect whatsoever of mindfulness. And as you can see, there are some studies that show absolutely no or close to no effect. And this is not unusual. This happens in a number of areas. So you do a meta-analysis to see, well, overall, is there a pattern in which, even if not every single study shows it, there is a pattern that mindfulness generally seeks or ends up reducing the level of cortisol, which is represented by these ROMs. So to the meta-analysis I reported on 2008, it was carried out by this issue of the American Psychologist, 2018. And I looked at the meta-analysis at 10 different, actually more than 10 different meta-analyses, all of which supported psi phenomena, the existence of psi phenomena. Now, one thing that you will see is that I will give you p-values, probability values, and a p-value estimates how probable a result is that it would not occur by chance. However, a p-value tells you very little about how large that effect is. So you may have a very, very small p-value, for example, that a particular distribution would not occur by chance in 10 million times, but actually the effect size, the deviation from how it would look when it happens by chance may be small. So as you will see in a moment, if the 5 different meta-analyses I chose to cover, their size level of effect sizes is somewhere, hovers around 0.20, which is small size, but it is a small size that you find in a number of other areas. It is comparable to, if you look at the third point here, to research in social psychology, where these investigators found that throughout the decades, the average effect size for social psychology studies was 0.21. And it is better, at least for a number of fMRI studies. So if you want to get technological, well, you cannot get much better than an fMRI. But if you look at regions of interest and you look at the intra-class correlation, how well does one result in one study correlate with another study? Here, the effect sizes range from 0.067, which is of course much lower than 0.21, to 0.48 that was large. But the main point here is to show that the effect sizes of parapsychology research are not different than what you find in social psychology, cognitive psychology, neuroscience, and other areas. So let's start with the first one. Cheers. This is a kind of study that was mostly done in the middle of the 20th century. And the gentleman that you see here is a famous Joseph Banks Rhine, and he is using also this set of 5 different cards, which are called the Zener cards. And in forced choice, the participant, might be asked to guess which card is coming next after Joseph Banks Rhine had shuffled them many times. And it may be that he does not even look at the card, but he's looking just at the back. So in a forced choice experiment, you have to guess between known alternatives, such as cards. The results showed that there was a significant effect, that is 0.10 to the 16 out of in 91 studies, but the effect size was very small, 0.04. And one thing is that nowadays, mostly we do not use forced choice designs, partly because of this. It has a very small effect size, and we use as well better controls. The next one is something that may be closer perhaps to your experience or the experience of someone you know, and that is cyan dreams, whether a person in a dream may know of something that is happening someplace else, or maybe even in the future. But let's take here a kind of design that was carried out in the famous Maimonides medical school in a set of studies. And what they did was to have the participant hooked to electrodes so that researchers would know when she was going to have a REM stage, which is when dreams, narrative long dreams, tend to happen. And while she was dreaming, she was separated from another person who was in another room. And then what would happen in another room is that randomly chosen, at that time, perhaps by dice, nowadays we use computers, but you would throw dice and you would choose randomly an image in another room, again, after the person had gone to sleep. And in this case, this may be the image of a boat. And then this is a person who is thinking, well, I would like Elizabeth to have her dreams reflect a boat. So that is the kind of design that you would do. So how does such procedure rule out alternative explanations? First, there is no sensory leakage because people are in different places. Second, cold reading. The person cannot read the body language of the person who has the information because, again, they are in different language, in different rooms. Number 3, it rules out against common influences. So if you were to, let's say, talk with an acquaintance and say, well, guess what I am thinking about now, that person may guess correctly, not because of psi, but because something happened in the day that affects both of you. Instead of that, the target is selected randomly in this study. And it also controls for the tendency to choose items in a certain order. So if you were to put the correct image always in the first place, you may end up getting a significant effect, which means nothing, because it might just show that people tend to select more images that are in the first place than other images. And then when you have carried out this study a number of times, you can do statistical analysis where if you have 4 different choices, 4 different images, the probability of selecting the correct one would be 0.25. So this is how, and there are more items, but this is how typically a size study controls a number of confounding variables. And there is also fluke results. If you get one study that shows an evidence, but 19 that do not, then you can easily say, well, that study was just a fluke. So what are the actual data in that? Well, the combined analysis of psi in dreams, looking at 52 different studies, was that it was extremely significant, 2.72 times 10 to the minus 7. And the effect size was a reasonable 0.18, a defensible 0.18, showing that this did affect to an extent the dream of the person, such as, let's take this example from the Maimonides series. In this case, there is a teacher who's dreaming in a lab set, and then somebody else in another room, there is again no contact between them, is looking at this print of Rufino Tamayo, of growling ferocious dogs. And the dreams of that teacher, because she was woken up after every REM stage, had a lot of aggression and eating and people eyeing each other. So an excerpt of this was, I was at this banquet and I was eating something like rib steak. And there you can see something that looked like ribs. And I was eyeing everybody, and look at those eyes. So the EEG dim, and by the way, for this meta-analysis, whenever you used a setup in which you could wake up the person after every EEG, after every REM stage, you would end up finding better results than when you asked them in the morning what they had dreamt about. So to give you an example, in the Maimonides series, there were 15 studies, and here the effect size here would be 0, would mean that there is absolutely no effect, that the person did not choose the correct print out of 4 or however many were placed to them, better than chance. And what you can see is that in a number of studies, in one of them perfectly, people tended to choose the correct image, being completely masked to them, interacting with research assistants who were completely masked as to the correct image, and they ended up choosing the correct one significantly better than would be expected by chance. And by the way, this was a meta-analysis carried out by Irving Child when he was a chair at the Department of Psychology at Yale University. Next, let's go. We have gone through 2. Let's go now to the kind of studies that we do here at Lund. We use something called the Ganzfeld. And in the Ganzfeld, you have a homogeneous sensory stimulation. Like here, you see this participant who is receiving red light, hearing white noise, something like shh, without any patterns, and has just been hearing relaxation instructions. And then this person tells what is going on his or her mind. Then she, or he in this case, he ends up selecting 1 image out of 4. Now, the selection happens here before the clip has been actually selected. So this is why this is a precognition study, because when he selects 1 image out of 4, the actual image has not been selected, but it gets selected later by a computer chip, by a random number generator in a computer, which again goes, selects, comes up with an image. So what do we know about meta-analysis of Ganzfeld? They have, here you see an overview of them all. First, there is one that was carried out in 2010, which I mentioned here. These are the statistics for them. And what you will see is that the average and the confidence intervals never touch what would be just random guessing, which would be 25%. So this is what happened in 2010. And when you add absolutely all studies, you still end up having an average that is more than 30, maybe around 32 or so percent of correct guesses, which is significantly better than you would expect by chance. and the effect size is about 0.14. Next, there are just 2 more to go, and then I will close up with giving some conclusions about it. Probably a number of you have heard about the implicit anomalous cognition or the BEM type studies. And what Daryl Bem, a very eminent social psychologist, do was to reverse a typical set of cognitive tasks where you would prime a person's response by first flashing something so quickly that the person would not be able to be conscious of it. For example, here, flashing half a second, an apple, and then later on show an image and see whether, when the person has been primed by looking subliminally at, let's say, the image of an apple, whether they respond more rapidly when the circle is by the apple instead of when it is by the other image. One thing about the BEM studies is that you may have heard that some people who did not replicate then said, well, this is false, we did not replicate. But of course, as I told you before, that happens in pretty much all areas. So a meta-analysis looks at what is the result looking at all of the studies that have been done. And when you do that, as BEM and collaborators did in 2015, you found that there was still a very significant effect. The probability was very small, and the effect size was 0.09 for all studies, or 0.11 for the fast studies in which the people had to respond immediately and not think about the response. Final study, this has to do with presentiment. And in a sense, this seeks to answer the question, can people get hunches that are real? And in presentiment, what is analyzed is whether physiology reacts before the presentation of stimuli. And here, what you find is that a stimulus is presented at this point right here, let's say 35 milliseconds. And what is interesting is not how the person reacts after the presentation, but what happens before the presentation. And there are 2 different types of stimuli. There are some images that are called, for example, photographs of sunsets, and there are images that are emotional, such as looking at a snake. And of course, these are randomly ordered. And what has been shown in 26 studies is that people seem to, or the physiology of people, end up reacting significantly with an effect size of 0.21 before they actually have seen that randomly ordered set of images. And in this particular meta-analysis, what Julia Mosbridge found out was that the higher the quality studies had the higher effect size. So I gave you 5 different meta-analyses, but I invite you to look at the paper. If you want, you can email me, and then I will send you a link so that you can get the paper and you can read it yourself. And there was an immediate response to it. And the most famous was critiques by a couple of psychologists, Rever and Alcock. And to quote them, in one of the responses, they wrote that data are irrelevant. They said that because psi phenomena are impossible according to physics. Now, those critics were criticized because a number of reasons, but let me give you 3 of them. To disregard data goes against basic science. So should you censor instead of arguing? Number 2, eminent physicists have supported psi research. Just to give you some examples, Albert Einstein wrote a preface to a book of parapsychology. The Curie couple, Marie Curie and her husband, did research on parapsychology. Other eminent living physicists have supported science. So it is not by any means the case that Rever and Alcock were talking for all physicists or even by all eminent physicists. And finally, they misrepresented psi research. For example, they wrote that psi methods are discarded continuously because they do not work. And in this meta-analysis, what I have shown is that perhaps the first one, forced choice, is the one that is no longer used, but the other studies have been carried out for decades. And for decades, they have continued to show significant effects. So another, let's say, a more creative follow-up to the 2018 paper is that studies continue to produce supportive results. They are here. For instance, in one journal issue, 4 out of 5 stringent Ganzfeld studies were supportive, found significant effects. There was also a meta-analysis of anomalous cognition among mediums, that is, mediums or channels who ended up coming with, under control conditions, with information about people they were being consulted about better than would be expected by chance, with an effect size of 0.18. So, to start summing up, in addition to those points, there are other points where we can say that we not only have information that psi is there, that psi is supported by meta-analysis of more than 10 different areas, but we also know that there are bigger effect size when people use free response kind of studies, that is all kinds of studies that I spoke about, except for forced choice, when you just let a person tell you what is going on in his or her mind. That is better than when they have to choose between, let's say, a set of cards. Number 2, when there is an alteration of consciousness or procedures that seek to alter consciousness, they end up doing better. And this image shows that. These are from Ganzfeld studies, or from a number of studies. And when you use Ganzfeld or other techniques such as hypnosis or meditation, you have larger effect size, significantly so, that when you didn't use anything and you just, for example, ask the students in your classroom to try to guess images. Number 3, you have larger effect sizes when you have selected participants, for example, people who are artists, who are meditators. And the final one is that physiological measures also show a somewhat larger effect than a number of other areas, as in the presentiment effect that I showed you before. So to conclude, with a very eminent psychologist in history, William James, in a letter wrote, "There is no source of deception in the investigation of nature which can compare with a fixed belief that certain kinds of phenomena are impossible." And in case you did not know, William James ended up researching for many years psi phenomena, and he was supportive of the reality of phenomena. So that is for it. I will have the slides in a PDF so that you can look them at your ease. And again, I will have some office hours if you want to ask me a question, or you can email me. So thank you for your attention, and I will start recording in a moment.